Good evening, everyone. We are back with another tech session this week. So, welcome to the StackLeague ReactJS Philippines tech session. I'm Casey Kalunad, and I will be your host again for this evening. We have another amazing resource speaker for this session, and this time he will share with us all about React. But before anything else, we'd like to give you an overview of Stack League, especially if it's your first time to join a Stack League event. Everyone, please help me welcome Mr. King Bartolome, our growth associate. Good evening, King.
Hi, Casey. Good evening. Good evening, everyone. Again, my name is King Bartolome. I'm one of the growth associates of Stack League, and tonight I will be giving a concise and brief introduction to Stack League.
Okay, so that's great. So, King, please share with us what is Stack League?
Okay, so Stack League is the Philippines' first year-round programming tournament or programming league with its mission to develop programming leaders to inspire a nation into coding. So, of course, Stack League is powered by StackTrek's fully automated talent analytics and assessment platform, to which Stack League gather thousands of IT students and professionals to compete and rank amongst the best programmers in the country.
Okay, thank you for that short introduction, King. Now, question: what are the benefits they can get from joining the league?
All right, before I share to you guys the benefits of joining Stack League. So first, Stack League is was launched last March 16. So it's a pioneering programming league gathering over 7,000 tech talents across the country to test their coding acuity with the promise, of course, of first nationwide recognition, thousands of prizes, hundreds of tech job opportunities, and invitation-only events. So earlier I said it's a competition. So since it's a competition, of course, there is a corresponding cash prize. So from 200,000 pesos, our cash prize is now at 300,000 pesos and it will continue to increase. So of course, Stock League wouldn't be possible without our partners. So we have Job Street as our co-presenter. We have Microsoft, Workbank, Rakuten Viber for our gold sponsors, and we have AWS and Caliber for our or as our silver sponsors, and we also have Accenture for bronze sponsors. So of course, we also have um, Inquiry.net and SparkUp as our media partners.
Mhm.
So aside from that one, we'd also like to thank our community partners who help the league reach as many programmers in the country as possible.
Wow, so thank you to our sponsors and partners. Now, King, what about the ranking system? How does it work? How are the players ranked?
Okay, so for the ranking system, so this is how the ranking system of Stack League works. So you will start at the bottom with 0 points. You solve as many challenges as you can, and you will earn points. So the more points you get, the higher your ranking goes, and the more opportunities are unlocked for you to access. So I just want to share to you guys. Here are the ranks in the league right now. So we have bronze, silver, and the highest is the gold rank.
Wow, that's great then. So, what about the supported languages, King? What are the supported languages of StackLeague?
Okay, so right now we have these five programming languages that are supported in the league right now. So we have JavaScript, Java, Python, C Sharp, and PHP. So of course, I would like to just to share to everyone one of the highlights of Stack League. So we have in the Stack League the weekly ranking both for individual and team category. So now you can view the weekly top 10 on our Stack League website, and you can also view there the overall top 50 players in the league.
Okay, that's great then. So, everyone, please take note of the five supported languages of StackLeague. Okay, so you've mentioned a while ago the ranking or how or where the players can view their ranks in the website. So, is there an extra credit for those who top in the competition?
All right. So I'm glad you asked that one, Katie. So of course, in Stack League, we make sure that we compensate or we leverage the opportunity of players that is top ranking. So in Stack League, we have the featured programmer campaign, wherein if you become part of the weekly top 10, you will be featured on our Stack League website and will be featured also to our different social media platforms. So in the next slide here, you can see the how it looks like when you're featured on our Stack League website.
Wow, that's really great then. So, King, let's say I have signed up for Stack League, but I can't seem to figure out how to solve the challenges, meaning I can't level up to the bronze level because I just started. What should I do? Is there a tutorial or training I can take up?
Oh, okay. For this one, if you just started your journey in the league, we have the starter level training. So you can take this training to so that you can level up to the bronze level, and you can get access to tech job opportunities. So for you to be able to enroll for this starter level training, you can visit this website, bit.ly/stackleague starter training, or as shown on your screens.
Okay, that's great news then. What about the other highlights, King? Are there other highlights we should know about where we can win prizes?
Okay, so this is the final highlight of Stack League. So we have the Stack League playoffs. So Stack League playoffs is for the individual players who can, or it's a single elimination tournament featuring all monthly qualifiers where all weekly top 10 will automatically be invited to the monthly qualifier round. So for you to have a gist or for you to understand how Stack League playoffs, here's a short clip for you to see. Okay. Okay, so moving forward, the top four players of the monthly qualifiers will actually receive 2,500 cash prize and will earn a spot to the qualifier pool. So if you want to be invited to our last monthly qualifier round on November 29, this gonna be your last chance to join. So if you want to learn more, visit stackleague.com. And I think that sums up our overview with Stackleague. Back to you, Casey.
Wow, so that's really great, King. Thank you so much for sharing with us a short introduction of what Stack League is all about. So if there's anyone here interested in joining, please visit our website. Okay, so now uh, let's proceed to our session proper. Now, may I remind everyone that if you have any questions for our resource speaker this evening, you can type them in the comment section. We will address them later at the Q&A session. All right, so without further ado, let me introduce our speaker for this evening. He is a software engineer at Paymongo, the first Filipino fintech to break into Y Combinator. He has an accumulated 4+ years of industry experience with React and serves as one of the community leads at ReactJS Philippines. Outside of work, he spends his Saturday mornings teaching kids how to code through the AHA Learning Center's Barangay Coding Program. Let's all welcome Mr. Miguel Galace. Good evening, Sir Miguel.
Hi, good evening. Thank you, Casey, for having me.
Of course. So, the floor is yours, Mr. Miguel.
Yeah, let me share my screen and begin my presentation. So, hi, everyone. Good evening. Um, my topic today is very simple. It's really about why, uh, why React, right? Why React came to be a thing, why React caught on, and I'll explain more why I chose this title in a bit. But first, some introductions. As Casey mentioned, my name is Miguel N. Galace. You can find me at my website, galacemiguel.com. I'm also currently an engineer at Paymongo, which, as Casey mentioned, is the first fintech in the Philippines to break into Y Combinator, which is the most prestigious startup accelerator in the world. And I'm also a co-director at ReactJS Philippines. So, as I alluded to earlier, when I gave this talk this title, it was about answering the question why we need to use abstractions like React to build modern websites. So that's one of the questions I want to answer in terms of why. The second one is why React caught on versus other frameworks at the time. And sorry if you're a bit disappointed, but this isn't going to be a talk about why you should use React over Angular, Vue, Svelte, or any of your other favorite modern front-end frameworks. This is more of a discussion on how React or why React conquered everything that used to be in the past and has outlived everything else that existed at the time. So let's get into it. And I want to start by asking, how do we build websites, right? And, it's a very loaded question, but maybe we can make it more digestible by reframing it a bit. So instead, let's ask, what are websites made of? And I'm sure there are a lot of students here. In spite of that, I'm sure everybody is familiar with the three basic elements to a website. So that would really generally be HTML, of course, CSS, and of course, JavaScript. So these are the three central components that we have whenever we have a website. Regardless of how complex a website ends up being, at the end of the day, it's really just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, right? So do you remember the good old days when we had websites that we could create just by creating a new folder and then creating a new index.html file? It was really just that simple, right? This was something that you probably did in high school, or maybe even before that, if you were taught or learned at an earlier age. And so maybe when you wanted to make it a bit more fancy, you could create another folder within that and have a CSS file, to spruce it up a bit. And if you were really fancy, maybe you had a scripts file, and that was where you put in the JavaScript to add some interactivity to your website. But really, this is how we built websites before, right? Or at least in the extremely early days of the internet. Everything inside of a website folder was basically written by hand, and you as the developer wrote basically every single line of code. So that's how we used to build websites before. But websites today are a lot more complicated. But I would like to perform a thought exercise. If maybe let's say Facebook built their websites in the way we used to do it before. So if we were to follow that same template, maybe for the profile page, we could just also have a profile.html file, a corresponding profile CSS file, and a corresponding profile.js file. So if you have another page, you just do the same thing. So this is for Facebook pages. Again, you would just add a page.html, a page.css, and a page.javascript. And, well, for another page, again, you could just do the same. And this was, you might start to see a bit of a trend with this kind of approach. But the reality is, this won't scale, right? The nav bar alone, that small chunk of website you see at the top of each of those pages, the HTML of that alone is 1,000 plus lines. So if that's pertaining to just to each of these files, they start out with 1,000 lines of HTML already. What more the CSS that goes with it, or the JavaScript that goes with the nav bar? Everything would become completely unwieldy. And again, we're all programmers here, right? One of the earliest pillars we're taught, we're not supposed to make things inefficient like that by writing things over and over. So that's the first problem. But the second thing is, how do we deal with elements whose HTML is the same, aside from the content? So how about something like a post, right? Whether it's a post inside of a group, inside of a Facebook page, or inside of a Facebook profile, I mean, they're all basically like the same elements, right? They have content, they have the author, there's a comment section. It's just the content that's changing. But the HTML and probably the JavaScript and CSS behind it, it's all the same. And this is what I was getting to earlier. One of the earliest things that we're taught as a programmer is dry, right? Don't repeat yourself. And while, of course, this doesn't always hold true, in this case, it applies in many of the contexts we discussed earlier. So it would be nice, for example, if instead of having so much duplication between our files, maybe we could like break it up into Lego blocks. Let's call them modules. So if you remember the navbar we were talking about earlier, instead of copy pasting that navbar HTML between profile, page, and group, maybe we could just break it up into its own component, into its own module. Same for posts. Again, the HTML is pretty much the same, right? Maybe if we could pull it out and break it down into its repeated components, then we could just store it in a file and bring all of those modules together, basically assemble them like Lego blocks to be able to come up with pages. So rather than have a bunch of duplication spread across different files, maybe we could break an HTML, a CSS, and JavaScript file down into its modular pieces and then just assemble them like Lego blocks to build our website. And it turns out we can do just that thing with React. React allows us to dynamically assemble web pages using components and props. So let's talk about that first thing, components. You know how in HTML we have what are called elements. And, it's the simple stuff. H1, button, A for anchor, IMG. This is the sort of basic stuff that I actually teach some of my students, my barangay coding students on Saturday. So this is simple. But in React, instead of having just what are called HTML elements, we have what are called components. And straight away, you might notice that one difference is, yes, they do start with capital letters generally, but also you can name them any valid JavaScript identifier. So this funky looking component that you see down here is actually valid JavaScript because apparently these symbols are valid in JavaScript. But you can name them anything, and you would be able to write them inside of your HTML, just like any other HTML element. So here's a really simple example of what a React component looks like. And if it's a bit daunting, let's break it down into its component pieces. So I'm sure that you guys will definitely recognize this bit. This is really just an HTML string. It's not technically an HTML string, but you can think of it that way. So it's really just one div, it has an H1, and inside of it, a list of posts. And outside of that, the syntax might look a bit funky if you're not yet familiar with JavaScript. So let's break it down. So here, we're basically saying, okay, define a variable, a constant, called profile page. And to that variable, assign a function. So this is just this function syntax for JavaScript. Assign a function that returns that piece of HTML. So that's it. That's the React component. But because this is JavaScript, and because we have a function here, we can do other things inside of that function before we return, like defining a variable. So let's make things a bit more interesting. Instead of hard coding the lists, the posts down here inside of our unordered list, we can create a posts variable which stores just the content of those posts. And then within our HTML string, we can invoke the map function of JavaScript and just come out with one list item element that has the content of the post. And this works because React allows you to write JavaScript inside of your HTML string by using curly braces. So if, for example, you wanted your H1 to instead show 2 instead of a profile page as it did earlier, you can write curly braces and then put in any valid JavaScript expression. So of course, we all know that 1 + 1 will evaluate to 2. And JavaScript will evaluate that expression and then return 2 inside of our H1. So most React components actually will also, apart from just having HTML elements, will also have React components inside of them. So you can sort of see how we can gradually build up our website by building small components and putting them together to create even larger ones. So a profile page component might be made up of a navbar component, a cover photo component, a header component, and a feed component. So we can just sort of assemble all these to build up to a larger piece of the puzzle, if you will. So the second thing I want to talk about is props. And we're going to use props to solve that other problem I discussed earlier, which was how we deal with elements whose HTML is mostly the same, right? So I'm sure, again, everyone here is familiar with HTML. You know how we have those things called attributes that we could pass different strings into that would allow us to change the behavior of certain components. So for example, if you wanted to have a placeholder on your name, you would just type placeholder and then inside of double quotes, write in name. If you wanted to change how many rows your text area displays with, you could pass in a number, 3, maybe 5. And for links, we can change how links behave by passing in a different link to our href attribute. So React components have their own version of HTML attributes, and they're called props. Props are really similar to HTML attributes, except instead of being able to take in just strings, React props can also take in any valid JavaScript expression. So in this example, we're passing in the number 458. So notice again how we're using those curly braces. We can also pass in Boolean values. And again, it's just any valid JavaScript expression. So it could be an object. It could be any other data type that you imagine. That's the beauty of doing it with React. So let's say we wanted to write a profile badge component that had a user prop, or like in HTML terms, had a user attribute. So if we were to try to put in this object, if we were to try to pass in this object into the profile badge component, let's say this is how we wanted it to display when React outputs everything to the DOM. How would we write that? So again, this is what the definition of that component might look like. But I have a bunch of unfilled pieces here. So how do we then grab the user prop? Simple. First, inside of our function, we declare the props parameter. And from that props parameter, we can grab the user key, because React will pass in whatever is given as props here, which you can then access using the name of the prop. And that name is, again, used here. So user here corresponds to user here. And notice here how we're passing into user a data object that has a URL, avatar, and name key. So inside of our component, we can access that by just doing dot URL, dot avatar, and dot name on user. And when we put this all together, we can come out with a component instance that looks like this. And if we were to change the object, the data object that we pass in, it would end up looking like this. It's simple stuff. But just because it's simple doesn't mean that we can't use it to build even more complex components. So if you remember the post component earlier, we can recycle the profile badge component that we made just now inside of our post component, and then put it all together to create even more complex pieces. So again, this is sort of how you see the Lego aspect of React coming to play. So from something as simple as an avatar, as a profile badge, you can build up to a post, and then maybe eventually you can build up all the way to a news feed. So it's just a little bit of assembling is what it takes. So by building and composing components and feeding them dynamic data through props, we can build incredibly complex UIs with React. Oh, I might have hit a wrong button, so let me skip ahead a bit. So this is actually the halfway point of my presentation. So feel free to take a breather if you need to, maybe stretch a bit. While I cycle through what we just discussed, maybe you can use it as sort of a recap until we get back to where we left off. Okay. So many of you, or some of you who know how to do web development already, are probably at this point thinking, wait a minute, React wasn't the first to do something like this. Every front-end framework at the time was already doing templating. So React just called it something different. They call it components, right? But templates, components, they're basically the same thing. It's nothing new. But what made React different and why it caught on and outlived everything else was its conceptual model. So we're going to get a bit technical here in this half of my presentation. If you open the ReactJS website, this is basically the React documentation, you'll see that the first thing that they talk about is React being declarative. So what does that mean? What does declarative mean, right? Outside of a programming context, let's dissect what declarative means. Okay, Google, how many points did Tyler Hero score against the Utah Jazz?
According to CBS Sports, Harrow recorded 29 points, 3 assists and 2 rebounds across 34 minutes off the bench in Saturday's win over Utah.
So I'm not sure if you guys were able to hear or see that, but Google was able to give me the response. How about if we did it a bit differently? What if you could do it like this? You say, Google, visit the NBA.com website, open the game schedule, go to November 6, 2021, open the box score for the game between the Miami Heat and the Utah Jazz, search the name Tyler Hero, then read back to me the number under the points column. So you can probably sort of see why this second example never made it into production, right? Google didn't allow you to do something that complicated. It's a bit cumbersome, right? You just want to know one thing, but you're sort of having to explain step by step how to do it. So that's the difference between something being declarative, where you describe what you want, versus something being imperative, which is describing how to achieve something. The difference is doing it imperatively is basically providing a step-by-step explanation as to how to do something, as opposed to just asking for what you want and getting it back. So here's a code example. If we can come back to programming. If we were to remove odd numbers from an array, we could do it in JavaScript like this. Step 1, define your numbers array. Step 2, define a for loop that iterates through your numbers array. Then for each iteration, if it passes this condition, then delete that number from the array. So that's doing it imperatively. We're sort of having to go step by step, do this, then do this. If we do it declaratively, we just tell React, okay, using the filter function, using this function I pass in, give me back whichever numbers will pass this condition. And so that will give us the same result as the code earlier, except we're doing it declaratively. And so what you might notice is that the imperative code is more concise. So that's one of the things we're after, right? We always want shorter, more beautiful code. Well, not always, but in some cases, it's useful. And I think you'll agree that in terms of readability, the write is a lot more compact and understandable. So the second example is setting focus ring styles. So for those of you that might not be familiar with what a focus ring is, a focus ring is basically that little blue outline that shows up every time you hit tab. And every time you hit tab, it might show up on a different element. So here's an example of that on Facebook. You can see the blue outline on the memories button here. So if you were to do that imperatively, here's how you could do it. Step 1, select an element. Step 2, add an event listener to when that element gains focus. And then step 3, that's when you say, okay, when this element gains focus, assign the border color to be blue. And again, you just do the same for the blur event, where instead of setting it to be blue, you set it to be transparent. Whereas with CSS, you can do it declaratively. You just say, okay, you use this focus pseudo selector, which we can bring up by using the colon symbol. And CSS just sort of knows, okay, this is what focus means. And again, it's more concise. We're not having to explain how to do it step by step. We just sort of write out, almost like a sentence, what we want our code to do. And the program takes care of the rest. So one last example. Let's go back to that profile badge that we made earlier. How would it look like if we were to do that imperatively? If you were assembling that piece of UI, you could start out by creating the anchor element, then set the href attribute to be this particular link. So I'm actually not going to talk through this whole thing because it's quite cumbersome. Basically, every single line there is a step within that process. So it's quite long, it's quite verbose. And contrast that to the declarative version of this piece of code. I think we will all universally agree that this is a lot easier to read, easier to consume, because again, we're not having to describe describe step by step what's happening. We just sort of write what we want, and the program takes care of the rest. So that's how the declarative APIs work. There's a bit of magic under the hood, but we trust that it'll work as we expect. And the result is the code ends up looking a lot prettier. So again, imperative versus declarative. Declarative is a lot more concise. So what point am I making here? This isn't to say that web frameworks before used to look like this, right? Because that's completely not true. It's just that websites these days are becoming so complicated. So take the Spotify web player. This isn't the Spotify app. This is the Spotify website. that you can find on open.spotify.com. And you can just see how complex this user interface is. So can you imagine if instead of writing this out as HTML, we had to do it in JavaScript? That would be a nightmare, right? And on top of all of this UI complexity, it's not just static, right? There's so many different moving parts. We're having to keep track of which particular song is playing and what the timestamp is on that particular song, how much volume we've dialed in. And the list goes on and on, like which particular module is selected, in this case, home, right? It's a very long list of state that we're having to represent. So Google Docs as well. Google Docs, again, is an extremely complex web application. You have to keep track of which elements, which buttons are disabled, and you also have to keep track of which ones are selected. Inside of many websites, in this case Dropbox, you might have a modal that's open. And on Twitter, if you favorite a particular tweet, instead of having an empty heart, it'll show up as filled. So we have to have this mechanism for also updating the UI when we've incremented our business logic inside of our code, right? So if we say, okay, this tweet, instead of just having 2,900 favorites, it now has 2,901 after the user clicked on the favorite button. So after that happens, we then have to update the UI to show a red heart because the user just favorited that tweet. So what am I getting at? User interfaces are inherently stateful. The examples I gave earlier were just a few, but they have so much state that you need to keep track of. So the question then becomes, how do we keep application state, our business logic, in sync with our UI? If the count is now 2,901, how do we then update the favorite button to be filled? And the dominant frameworks at the time, this was about 2013 when React came out, they tried to manage state using an MV star architecture. So MV star might sound familiar to you. I'm sure a lot of you probably know what Model View Controller is, MVC. So the star there just stands for anything else. So star could be view model or anything else. Typically, it's controller. And here's an example of an MV star framework that was really popular when React came out. This was about, again, 2013. It's called Backbone. And with MV star, we had models, right? So this is an example of a tweet model. And the model is basically a representation of a unit of data. And so in this case, what we're trying to model here is a tweet. So a tweet has a lot of properties. It could be how many replies it has, who tweeted it, how many favorites, has the tweet been favorited, a bunch of things. But in this case, we're opting to just model whether or not a particular tweet has been favorited. And so we're using the isFavorited property to determine that. And by default, it's false. So inside of this model, we're also declaring a favorite function, which basically just says, okay, if the state of isFavorited is currently false and the favorite function is called, then change it to true. And the same is true vice versa. So if it's true and you click on favorite, it'll unfavorite, right? So this is basically what that favorite function is saying. Basically toggle the isFavorited Boolean. So this is what the rest of Backbone code might look like. This is the V in MV star. This is the view. And inside of Backbone, in a separate file, this time an HTML file, you would have this piece of HTML. And so let's imagine that this particular piece of HTML is representing a tweet. And again, you saw earlier that inside of a tweet, we have a favorite button, and that's represented by this unfilled heart that you see. So corresponding to this HTML view, we also have some JavaScript that will interact with the HTML that we have. So it's a lot to take in. So let's break it down into its component parts. The first thing we're saying here is when the element with class favorite is clicked, that being this button, then invoke the favorite function, which is pertaining to this. And this function is just calling the favorite function that we defined earlier. So all it's doing is if you click on that heart, then it'll toggle between, the tweet will toggle between being favorited and unfavorited. And then the rest of the code is basically what we're using to be able to update our HTML to reflect the state of our model. We're saying, okay, whenever our tweet model changes, invoke the render function. And what does the render function say? Well, if the model is in fact favorited, then select the favorite element or the element with class favorite, which is this, then change its HTML to be a filled heart. If it's not favorited, then again, select the element with class favorite and then set its HTML to be an unfilled heart. So again, it's sort of this step-by-step process that you almost get the feeling, you know, we can do better, right? This is imperative. How can we write it declaratively? In React, this is how you would write that using the hooks API. So most of this code you should be familiar with, but let's break it down step by step. So this is the equivalent of the model that we discussed earlier. Instead of having it in a separate file, we just declare it at the top of our React component. And we create this piece of state that is pertaining to whether or not the tweet is favorited. So the first thing that it returns is a Boolean value that tells you whether or not the tweet is favorited. And the second thing it returns is a function that will allow you to update that state. So the next part of this code that I want to discuss is this favorite function. So again, this favorite function is no different than the favorite function that you saw earlier in the model. It's really just toggling the isFavorited piece of state. And lastly, we're returning a small piece of HTML. But notice that directly inside that HTML, we just sort of write, okay, is this particular tweet favorited? If it is, then return a filled heart. If it's not, then return an unfilled heart. So you can see how concise this example is compared to what we had earlier. It's a lot simpler. It's a lot more declarative. So this example is so much simpler because React doesn't draw hard lines between parts of your code like MV star. So if, for example, earlier we had multiple files that corresponded to our model and multiple files that corresponded to our view, in React, everything is in one JavaScript component. And because everything is just JavaScript, everything blends together to create beautifully declarative UIs. And again, if you're not yet sold, if you're sort of still trying to figure out what the imperative part in the backbone code is, let me reiterate it one more time. So step one in the backbone version would have been select the element with class favorite, which pertains to this, and depending on its isFavorited state, then set its HTML to be a filled or an unfilled heart. So it's a multi-step process. Step one, select the element. Step two, set its HTML to be something else. Whereas in React, we just write it. So much simpler. And the last thing I want to leave you with, because this is basically the end of my talk, is one funny thing at the time when React was announced. This was back in 2013. It was announced at JSConf US, which is just this huge JavaScript conference by a bunch of Facebook engineers. And the reception was lukewarm, if we're being generous. So actually, after that presentation, someone in the audience sarcastically tweeted, "Facebook, rethink established best practices." So he was basically saying, this MV star, this MVC thing, it's the way forward, it's the proper way to build web apps. And I guess he just took exception to how Facebook did it, which was to, let's be brutally honest, remove that separation of concerns and put everything into one component file. But the result is that by doing it this way, we can write our UI declaratively. And of course, history will show that, in fact, after React came out, basically everybody started to follow suit, where everybody now wants to do a declarative component-based front-end framework or library. And so that's sort of the precedent that React was able to establish. So if I want you guys to take away anything from this talk, apart from all of the technical jargon, it's that, keep doing what you're doing. Even if you might have people that doubt the direction in which you're headed, as long as you believe strongly enough that this is the right thing for you or for the industry to move towards, then go for it, because you never know how much you'll be able to change. And so hopefully I was able to answer the question, why React? And I'm sure you actually will have more questions at this point. But if you're not able to ask them immediately after this, you can reach me through these channels. And again, I'd like to thank StackLeague, Casey, and Haifa for inviting me to speak. That's the end of my presentation. Casey, I'm obliged to tell you that you're muted. So
Okay, there. So, great. It's a great talk. Thank you very much for the comprehensive and informative talk, Sir Miguel. And we are now open. We are now opening the floor for questions. So we are going to course through our comment section and see which ones of our participants here have some comments about the talk or for our resource speaker for this evening. Okay. Let's try here. Okay. So I have before while waiting for the questions from our participants, I do have a question, Sir Miguel. For those who are, let's say, who are really interested in using React, does React or yes, does React JS community or sorry, React JS Philippines offer free training to aspiring programmers?
right. So allow me to use this opportunity to plug our community.
Mhm.
So guys, if you haven't joined yet, we have a Facebook group as well as a Facebook page, ReactJS Philippines. Um, Periodically, we will have these sort of tech sessions as well to introduce different pieces of React. And everyone is free to join. So if you're a student, if you're an early professional, we welcome everybody, and our group is very vibrant. Kung magtatanong kayo dun sa Facebook group, marami talagang sasagot. So I encourage you guys to join and come in with your questions kasi marami nga talagang willing na tumulong sa inyo if you guys are so willing. So that's ReactJS Philippines. Hanapin niyo kami sa Facebook.
Is it only on Facebook, Sir Miguel, or do you have like in
We have
other platforms?
we have other channels. We have a Discord channel, but
Mm-hmm.
generally our Facebook group is the most active. So I will point you guys in that direction.
Okay, so that's great then for anyone here who is very interested or you might have some questions later or after this session, you can go to ReactJS Philippines Facebook page or Facebook group, so you can ask the people there, the people in the community, and they will be able to help you out. Okay, thank you so much, Sir Miguel. Now let's go to our comment section again and see if we have some questions from our participants. We have from okay, so I'm flashing the question here. We have from Elton Bagne. Do you know now which is the leading front end framework, or have any statistics which is more popular?
So I looked this up just now.
Mhm.
Ano ba? I think if we're talking about jobs and if we're also talking about generally number of websites on the internet, I do believe if the statistics I'm looking at based on this website are correct, React still is the dominant in terms of websites on the internet, or in terms of awareness at least. So let me just enumerate the statistics I'm looking at. So in terms of framework awareness, React and Angular at 100%. Vue is at 99%, and then there's Ember, and then Svelte. Um, so I guess in a sense, you could say React is the most popular. And I actually sort of want to make a point here, because I know that inevitably somebody's probably going to ask why React over those other frameworks that I just talked about, right? And actually, I'm not qualified to give an answer beyond React really is the most popular. And that's a good thing, because if we're talking about um, finding answers to problems, so syempre, diba, lahat tayo nagsa-Stack Overflow. If you guys are going to Google, palaging merong lalabas na sagot for React. And that might not always be the case if you're using, something like Svelte, not as popular. So on top of that, there's a lot more documentation. There's a lot of different libraries that have come out that are also supporting or are meant to be used in conjunction with React. So basically, the React community is gigantic. So if ever you run into any problem, it's either A, already solved, or B, somebody is willing to help you find the solution. So I think that's one good reason to choose React over any other at this point.
Okay, so I hope that answers the question, Elton Bagne. Thank you also for asking this one. We have a quick question from Retz Gutierrez. Sir, ano po yung FB group? For those who are very willing to join.
Ayan. So I think, wait lang, let me see if I can bring up the link.
That's great.
I'm not sure of the exact URL ng group mismo, but I think I can share it with Casey after, or I can comment it on the Facebook Live later. But
Sure.
search nyo na lang sa Facebook, ReactJS Philippines. It's a private ba siya? Pero kung sinearch nyo, lalabas yan. Ganun na lang.
Okay, so you can check later in the comments. Sir Miguel will comment it later under this live stream. Thank you very much. So for those who are interested, you are very welcome to join the Facebook group for ReactJS Philippines. Okay, so another question po, Sir Miguel. We have from Stephen Balo. Good evening po. Which is better in terms of performance, React Native or Flutter?
Medyo mabigat yung tanong na yan. Again, I'm not qualified to answer this question, because the React that I have experience with, and most folks will have experience with, is going to be the React framework, the React library that pertains to the web. So if I hadn't specified earlier, there's actually two different flavors of React. So there's one that pertains to the web, which would be React for websites, and the second, which is what Mr. Balo here is referring to, which is React Native. So that's the flavor of React that pertains to mobile apps, kunyari sa smartphone or iOS. And Flutter, it's a different thing altogether. So I can't give a definitive answer on this, but I don't know that one is necessarily better than the other.
Hmm. Does it come down to like which one is really your preference, Sir Miguel?
I think, to be honest, it does somewhat come down to that,
Mm-hmm.
but also you really have, of course, because if we're going to be speaking in terms of industry, it's going to be based on what the priorities of the company are. So, if, for example, the priorities of your company might be performance, then I think in this case it's a valid question to ask for Mr. Balo. Um, that would probably outweigh preference, unless we're talking about personal projects.
Okay, so thank you for that answer. Now let's proceed to our next question. We have from Jeko Javien. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that. His or her question is, what is the difference between libraries and frameworks? Which one of the two is React?
Yeah, and so it's a good question. I think people often mix the two. So the difference is
Mhm.
React is a library. It's a UI library. It's not a framework. So the difference is frameworks will sort of enforce how you're supposed to write um, your code in sort of a very rigid structure. So one example might be Rails, where again you have models, views, and controllers, right? You have to write it according to how the application dictates. And then the application, which is in this case, the framework is in charge of calling your code. Um, the difference with a library is you're in control. You structure your code how you want, and you're the one who's in charge of invoking the code of the library. Whereas with a framework, it's the other way around. So in simpler terms, libraries are smaller, more lightweight, and they're pieces of your application. You can have multiple libraries inside of one application, whereas generally you will have one framework when you're using a framework, and that will dictate how you write your entire application.
All right, so thank you for that. I hope that also answers your question. Next, we have from JZ Tan. Any advice for struggling newbie programmers? So I guess it's a more of a general question.
That's a tough one. Because honestly, for me, I love programming. It's like even before I got into college or found a job, it's sort of been like a passion for me because I just find so much joy in writing code and the result that comes out of it. So I guess I guess the answer would just be to love what you do. I think generally people who get into code will enjoy coding or get into it because they enjoy coding or are curious about coding.
Mm.
And of course, there will be times when you're burnt out, but that's when you need to step away. But generally, if you enjoy what you're doing, it's something that you will just keep, you know, working at. So ako kahit hindi trabaho, I still try to keep up with programming. Ano ba yung latest na front-end frameworks? Just because I enjoy it so much. Kasi hindi na lang siya parang trabaho sa akin. It's like my hobby. So yeah, I guess find find joy in programming. If you can't, maybe you need to take a break. But yeah, generally, that's really my 2 cents on it.
Wow. So thank you for that wonderful advice, Sir Miguel. Now we have another question from Alejandro Miguel III. What are the limitations of React, sir?
Hmm. So there are many, of course. Um, I guess one thing I can touch on is that, of course, no framework, no library is perfect, and among them would be React. So there's a lot of talk about React um, not necessarily being completely efficient because of what it's using under the hood to make the declarative API work. So I'm not going to expound too much on that, but you can look it up. It's called the virtual DOM. And so basically, this is how React is able to make its declarative API work, because it sort of does some magic in the background. And again, with magic, there will always be inefficiencies. And that's sort of the trouble when you have a bit of magic. And if you were to put it up against something more specialized towards being as efficient as possible, like Svelte, it's probably not going to be as fast. But the key when we're talking about React is it's fast enough. Like fast enough to the point that 99.9% of your users probably aren't going to notice unless you're building something really, really complicated. So if you want to look that up, you can search virtual DOM. That would be a good segue into the topic.
All right. So thank you for that. I hope that answers also the question for Alejandro. We have another question from Retz Gutierrez. Any tips? Another tip question. Any tips or advice, sir, to easily adapt and dig into the architecture of React for the beginners?
So I think for me, my biggest tip would just be to keep it simple. So this is sort of in reference to one of the questions earlier, but when you have libraries, and in this case, React is a library, it's not dictating how you're supposed to write your code, right? So when you have React, when you include it in your project, you'll find that oftentimes you can also include a bunch of other libraries. And people sort of fall into this trap when they're using React for the first time. They always want to use what everyone else is using. So they start, pulling all these different libraries. And a lot of the time, it's not really necessary. And I think one good example of that would be Redux. Based on my short time so far in the industry, I've seen from two different companies where they sort of went into a Redux architecture because it was, the hot button topic at the time. But there wasn't so much of a need for it, and it really just sort of overcomplicated the architecture. So I think for me, my answer to this would just be to keep things simple, and only when you really need something, when you're sure that you need it, that's when you grab something and put it into your app.
Okay, thank you so much for that advice as well, Sir Miguel. Next, we have a few more questions here. We have from Reyes Paul. How Next.js is any different to vanilla React po?
Okay, so this is there's a quick one-line answer to this. So I'm just going to give that because I'm not completely familiar with Next.js. But when we're talking about React is what's called a client-side UI library, which means that websites are rendered on the device of the user. So for example, if I were to open StackLeague.com, it's my computer that is doing the processing necessary to display this website. Whereas something like Next.js, which is basically a React framework, instead of making your computer do the processing necessary to make your website show up, the processing is done by the server on which StackLeague.com is hosted. And what you get back is the website already pre-rendered. So that's called server-side rendering versus client-side rendering. And that's the main advantage to Next.js.
Oh, so does that mean it loads faster?
That's a good point. Hold on, my webcam is going out of focus. But yes, Casey, in most cases, it will load faster as a result.
Okay, there. All right. Thank you for that answer, Sir Miguel, and for the question as well, Reyes Paul. Next is from Albert Arevalo. How will you be able to handle more action using Redux?
So again, we're getting into the topic of Redux. how will you be able to handle more actions using Redux? I'm not quite sure what Albert is getting at here, but um, the Redux documentation is quite comprehensive. So I would honestly point you in that direction. But also, my bigger piece of advice is if you're wondering whether or not you need Redux, you probably don't need it. So my nuclear answer to your question would be just don't use Redux.
Okay, so and also if you want to know more, Albert, you can you're very welcome to also ask Sir Miguel after our talk. Maybe you can
Yeah.
ask a few more questions. Okay, next is from Raiden Shogun. We have, does using a more simple framework like ReactJS do the job of a more extensive framework in creating a website?
So again, we touched on this earlier. Um, React, like you mentioned, it's simpler. It's a library. It's not a framework. So again, that means that generally, it won't have all the bells and whistles that a framework will come with. So maybe the short answer is no, but because it's a library, you can also just pull in other libraries that will fill in those gaps for you. So by no means am I saying that React is underpowered compared to anything else. I'm just saying that out of the box, technically speaking, React won't be able to do everything that, say, Next.js does. But you can configure it in such a way as to make it like that. It just doesn't happen immediately. But that can be good or bad. It's a long discussion.
Okay, so again, a long discussion. You can always ask Sir Miguel after our talk. So we have a few more questions if you're all right with this one, Sir Miguel. We have from John Medel. React.js and React Native, what is the difference?
And so I touched on it earlier, so I'll give just a more brief answer. So again, there's two flavors of React. React.js, which pertains to React that works on websites, whereas React Native is the flavor of React that is meant for smartphones like Android or iOS. So that's the difference.
Okay, so thank you for that very brief answer, Sir Miguel. Next is again from Rex Gutierrez. Sir, how is the OOP in React from other libraries?
How is the OOP in React from other libraries? So you can do object-oriented programming inside of JavaScript, but um, I don't know that that's necessarily the paradigm that you will want to use inside of React. So I'll just leave it at that. It's not generally a concept. Oh, I mean, of course, there are times when it makes sense um, to do it like that, because when you're representing certain things, you can do it using an object. But generally, when we're building UI, it's born of a function, and um, it's I'll just leave it at that. It's not not necessarily a paradigm that I mean, again, you can use it in that regard, but it's it, it's like apples and oranges a bit.
Okay, so thank you again, Sir Miguel. We have I think our last three questions. This one is from Mark Potane, Python plus React. Very
ah,
short question.
yeah, it's possible. So generally, you can have React on the front end, and Python is a language that runs on a server. So you can have an API or a backend written in Python, and then the two can communicate via a JSON API. So that's how you can mix Python with React. It can be done.
Okay, so I hope that answers the question. Next is from John Cueva. How do you become an expert in React.js?
The answer to that, Mr. John Cueva, is very simple. All you have to do is join the ReactJS Philippines Facebook group and like the ReactJS Facebook page. Pag ginawa niyo yan, guaranteed, expert na kayo.
Okay, so a little bit of plug in there, but really, a lot of people are very willing to help you if you want to learn more. Okay, and last, I think this is a follow-up question from Rets Gutierrez earlier. Sir, how and what is the difference of React from other libraries based on OOP?
Sige. I think you want to have a discussion on this. But let me um, get back to you on this, Rets. Baka pwede tayo mag-chat sa Facebook.
Mm.
Tsaka natin balikan. But yeah, you're very welcome to message me. Magpapakita na lang ako sa comments mamaya. Tapos mag-message tayo. So I can give you a more comprehensive answer kasi medyo mahabang usapan.
Okay, so if anyone here is also uh, or has some questions, you can always message or tap Sir Miguel or join their Facebook group. A lot of people will help you there. Okay, so I think that sums up our Q&A for this session. Thank you everyone or thank you for all the questions you've sent, and thank you very much, Sir Miguel, for a very comprehensive Q&A and very productive Q&A session. Thank you for imparting your invaluable knowledge with us. And to everyone, again, thank you for your questions. We hope this has been a very fruitful session for everyone. Okay, so now before we go, don't go yet. We still have a few more announcements for our next sessions for November. Okay, so a few more events for November. We have Stack League, AWS Tech Session, Web and Mobile Application Development Made Easy with AWS Amplify with John Bonso on November 18, Thursday. That's next Thursday at 6 p.m. And the other one is a Stack League tech session, boosting software development productivity with one of Stack League's top players, Kim Clarence Penaflor, on November 25. Again, that's on Thursday at 6 p.m. So you can find all the registration details on our Facebook page. We hope you can also join us in the next Stack League events. Again, thank you so much for everyone who joined us at this Stack League ReactJS Philippines Tech session. Why React? If you also know someone who should be part of the league, please invite them to register now at stackleague.com. Thank you again and see you at the next Stack League event. Have a good night.